this work. When I was starting graduate school and working on thinking about what was going to be my PhD dissertation was at a time when the gun violence epidemic was hitting our communities all around the United States at the highest levels. That's when the death rates were the highest. Now, violence, as you'll see, because I'm going to share a few statistics with you, has been and is the leading cause of death for African American males and females between the ages of 15 and 34 ever since we've been collecting statistics, 30 years in a row. It's a huge problem. For me, I grew up in a little small town. I grew up on welfare. I lived in a home where I was not safe, and my passion for doing this work is to make a difference in the lives of young people so that no kid has to grow up feeling afraid. And we need a community to be caring and loving and protective for our children. And it might not always happen in the home. If it's not happening in the home, if it's not happening in the community, then what kind of hope do we have to give to our young people? My work is trying to inspire hope, and part of that process is trying to find answers to why do these things happen, what creates this dynamic where violence cycles from generation to generation, and the interconnections between poverty and violence, and that's what this work gets us to. I'm going to give you some key facts about youth violence and then talk about these three themes that I mentioned, and then talk about how if we stop thinking about violence in the particular way that we have been for decades, we could make some headway in this problem, and that is thinking about the situations and the events that young people who are overly exposed to violence and violent images and violent rhetoric and violent language, those images are they're not being counteracted with anything positive for a lot of kids, and we can do something about that. We know how to reverse that norm situation. So I already spoke a little bit about this, but one of the other things about me and what I do, and probably a unique feature for someone who's a faculty member at OSU, is that I'm very committed to doing applied work that's going to matter in the real world. That's not always rewarded in the academic structure, but I now have tenure, so I really don't care about that reward structure. And I can also say that the rewards of events like today and the relationships that I've made in a very short amount of time with people in this community have, more blessings than, I don't know, I can handle emotions. So, what are the patterns of youth violence, and what do we know about this problem that can help us to find solutions to the problem? Well, here's what I mentioned, the leading cause of death, and these are data from Ohio. Every state looks the same. Homicide is the leading cause of death for the particular age groups, and hopefully you can see across the top, but for 15 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds, homicide. And it's both sexes, and suicide, which is also a type of violence, is also right up there. And so these two issues, are just so critically important. And this is a trend diagram that shows you really that pattern that I was talking about when the gun violence youth problem epidemic peaked, right there in the early 90s when I was a graduate student. And so we've definitely come down, the rates have come down, and the data from 2006, 2007 are showing a little bit of an uptick, but we don't want to get overly concerned about year-to-year variation. The pattern here, as you see, since our rates since the early 80s are still way higher. So we might be content that we have less violence than we had in the 90s when it was completely off the hook, to now where we are, it's still way too high. Too many people are dying. And this is something that I want to impress on you, that most of this is preventable, and we know how to do it, we're just not doing it. part of the reason why we're not doing it, I believe, is because of the way we think about this problem. And I'm borrowing some material from Zimbardo, who's a very famous psychologist who did some really interesting experiments and has continued to do amazing work around what's going on in Abu Ghraib and, you know, sort of the structures that make violence happen and make it possible. And part of thinking about that is, and we are all probably guilty of this, is if you think about violence, the cause of violence is an individual-based phenomenon, the bad apple scenario, you have one type of response. If you think about it as the bad barrel, which is the situational response, and that, you know, people are put in circumstances and all of those circumstances lead to violence, which is part of what I do in my work, but it's not enough. It doesn't get us far enough, because the reality is that the bullet point number 3 here is that it's the bad system that creates the bad barrel that then allows an apple to go bad. And this type of thinking, if we could shift our thinking from thinking of that individual focused reason for violent behavior and started thinking about how do we unravel these systems, how do we make sure that the barrels, you know, the neighborhoods, the environments that our young people are growing up in aren't going to allow them to, you know, instead of growing to be healthy, positive, to instead spiral into behaviors that are all around them. So what I've done in this study, and been working on this for over a decade, 15 years of my life, has been devoted to this work and other work around victims of youth violence as well. But what's unique about this work is that we talked to these kids, and we did it in such a way where I recruited a team of ex-offenders. They, I'm actually going to just kind of go backward. This is a picture of our team in 1997. I had blonde hair there, and I looked quite different, and you can't really see the picture up on the screen. But that's Jeffrey Fagan, who was my PhD advisor, and Rich McLean, Devon Batty, Wetzel Wade, and David Tofino, and that was part of my team. I had 7 core people and about 16 guys that I worked with on a fairly regular basis over about a 4-year period of time. And so